Past research, very well documented, including my own as well, it has demonstrated very strong support for cultural maintenance by migrants, and that they prefer to keep their own culture as well as learning from mainstream culture, and they favor so much integrating to mainstream culture, but at the same time keeping their own with dual identity, having two cultural identity. And studies and research found that this has those who chose that integration strategy within the acculturation types and choices, it has a very strong association with psychological health or the individual's well-being. However, we all know that their views may, or their responses may change by the way the society is interacting with them, how they view their own acculturation. But again, in my study, it indicated that migrants and refugees, in particular youth, they embrace their national identity as Australian. Even it was my just recent study indicated even before they get the citizenship, they label themselves they are Australian, and that is a very interesting finding to see that they are so much favoring and wanting to integrate into the society, and they want to have that sort of acknowledgement from mainstream to accept them. Also, they are Australian despite all of their differences and the visible differences and invisible differences as well. I think the multi-way approach is critically important in intercultural communication and understanding of the perspectives that Australian, from the majority and minority backgrounds, they take it, because that mutual interaction is a core part of the way that minorities shaping that cultural identity that they wish to have. Another very important element and aspect that I wish to highlight is the importance of sense of belonging within the context of intercultural communication. Research again very much indicates, including my own as well, that identity with attachment to a community is an integral part of our psychological makeup. The place we call it home is critically important to our sense of belonging and also to our personal identity and our self-esteem. When people ask me how I have become who I have become in a new country, I immediately say because I have found Australia could be called home, and that sense of belonging. Although I see my dual identity very strong, and integration in my way of living is so strong. On primary level, I mix with my own culture, but on secondary level, always I identify myself with my national identity as Australian. For example, if I'm overseas presenting at a international conference, I call myself Australian. I carry that national identity. But when I am with my own community, of course, I use my person and my dual identity. I say I'm Persian Australian. And I think a sense of belonging is so critically important to build our personal identity and also self-esteem, which is critically important. But this only happens if we have that sense of belonging through a whole unity and education system approach as a mass criteria for us to feel belong, or for minorities to feel belong and call Australia whole. It is through a holistic approach, a whole community and education system approach from my perspective. Another core elements that I wish to highlight in that intercultural communication and its connection to well-being of each individual is the importance of culturally competent and compassionate leadership. And that leadership is in all levels, at the national level, societal level, organizational and community level, and individual level, of course, within the context of intercultural communications and also its impact within the individual psychological well-being. I think when I refer to compassionate leadership, this means that an authentic and ethically driven, which is founded on human qualities like wisdom, compassion, honesty, kindness, fairness, all of those virtues that we all have inside, but we usually hold it to just to close to us for our own benefit and also for the very loved one and close one. But if we could do that well in the form of leadership, and that is, I think, that exchange comes into the picture, both from individual and for self and for others, and from spiritual, from the leadership, which I call it compassionate leadership, and then it makes it possible, and that for the individual they become inspired, and also to for that level of authentic approach, the leadership when they have. Individuals become very much inspired and become determined to do the right thing, to do the right action, and also to have more inclusive approach to things, and benefit themselves, of course, and benefit others. Again, a key message that I feel it is critically important is the leadership, which is promoting goodness in others, and takes a strengths-based approach, enhancing and this is the way that enhances the individual's psychological well-being. The final point that I wish to make before I end my talk is, in its broad sense of the term, when we talk about intercultural competence, the dialogue between different cultures and mastering competency in relation to cultural understanding, cultural sensitivity, cultural safety, and all the elements of cultural competence, and in that dialect will be intercultural competence. In my view, it only can become a reality and can exist can exist and also assist the person's psychological well-being only possible when intrapersonal conflicts are resolved within the individual and within that society. But how this could take place, how this could happen, from my perspective, again, on both levels of both lines of the dialogue, the mainstream and minorities, both levels, individuals and leaders, I think the power of it could be possible only through the power of love and care for self, for others, for communities, and for societies at large. It happens only when we do through cooperation and mutual understanding. When we replace us and them, that othering, with we collectively and inclusively embrace as the whole population, not us and them, us and them. Another key element that I personally feel makes it only possible is the harmony in action and thought, the linkage between the mind and the heart through compassionate care. And if we define compassionate care, Rina Papadopoulos puts it so beautifully as an expert in that area. She says, understanding the suffering of others and wanting to do something about it using culturally appropriate and acceptable caring interventions. And if that compassionate care is in practice through harmony in action and in thought, means the heart and the mind is linked together and they are following each other, that is where the most impact comes. That intra-conflict between the person and within the system, it will go away for that best intercultural interaction. The fourth one, that is always, I have been an advocate for it, and that is a strengths-based approach in intercultural interaction and communications. Unfortunately, and without ill intention, but majority, they may, or most people, they may use deficit approach. Whereas in my view, I think when we have positive approach or strengths-based approach to our own qualities, the credentials and cultural values to each individuals and also to others, it makes a lot of life satisfaction for the individual, and that valuing not only their own values, others valuing their values as well. And that, I think, makes a huge difference in removing the tension and easing the dialogue in more harmony when it comes with the strengths-based approach, because we bring the strengths of the person to the core. For example, in some of the terms or language we use, in relation to even the language aspect of when we take the deficit approach, we say language problems. As from the strengths-based approach, how I see it, how I view it, I call it language rich, because those people who cannot speak well English because they have just been migrated or they haven't mastered English yet, they don't have problem in relation to their mother tongue. They have already a wonderful fluency in their own language. They can demonstrate it so beautifully well, as those people with English is their mother language, but they are trying to learn new language. And of course, English language is one of the overarching values, of course, and they are learning it. But meanwhile, while they are learning it, they are adding additional language. They don't have language problem. They add another language, and they are ahead of those who are monolingual, if I may call it. That's why a strengths approach is so important. Even when we are talking about the traumatic experiences that they have had, we tend to forget about if we take the resilience-based approach, it gives them much more strength, it gives them much more self-esteem and confidence to, even when it comes to mind, to deal with it, deal with those traumatic events that they have experienced it in the past. And lastly, the cultural fitness. I personally believe that cultural fitness should be on the agenda so much. Seeing one's cultural fitness as an integral part of one's mental well-being is something that I wish that to be a key message to be taken away, because when we need to address contemporary challenges to social cohesion, such as better understanding of the links between cultural differences and social identity, intercultural experiences, if we name a few, there are different attitudes, and the active and meaningful participation, if we want Australia to maintain its level of harmony and confront the forces and challenges that undermine belonging and active participation of minority groups. In my view, definitely, indeed, the future is intercultural, and it needs to be intercultural. Not because minority groups will bring the human power into that equation, as we discussed. I mean, the minority, according to ABS data, recent ABS data, almost 50% or 49% of the population either were born overseas or one of their parents were born overseas, and that is not adding the indigenous population into it. And then it is not because of the human power that we want to bring into the equation for the intercultural relationship. that no longer they are minorities. But I think because of the inclusive and harmonious approach in addressing issues that all Australians are facing, we need to have that intercultural understanding, and the future needs to be intercultural. This is definitely and indeed possible, but through culturally competent and compassionate, and through peace and harmony within and between individuals and communities. And I wish to end it with a wonderful statement that Sri Chinmoy captures it most beautifully. He says, peace means a flood of love in the world family. If we thrive and go with peace and harmony inside ourselves, and for everyone resolve issues through harmony and through that inclusive approach, I think we will have a new world, and we will have a good world family, that's for sure. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Tahira. It was really interesting to hear you say that interculturalism is a two-way street, and I look forward to discussing that further when we have questions. So next we're going to look at an example of how religion can encourage interculturalism. Religion has become an easy scapegoat when people hear about wars in parts of Southeast Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. For some, it's this belief that religion is at the core of conflict that has turned them away from faith altogether. But Professor Muhammad Abdullah is going to give people a reason to believe otherwise. I'd like to hand it over to him to enlighten us further and maybe even change a few minds.
Well, thank you very much, Saiba, and thanks to our hosts, and thank you so much, Associate Professor Tahira, for your wonderful presentation, very insightful and very uplifting.
Thank you.
Allow me to first begin by I guess, setting some parameters. And interculturalism, as far as I'm concerned, and this is what other scholars have said, it's about active and equitable interaction or interactions between groups over passive tolerance. So we don't want passive tolerance, we want active and equitable interaction. But it's also about deep understanding and respect for all cultures. It focuses on the mutual exchange of ideas and cultural norms and the development of deep relationships. So perhaps we could say that at the local level, interculturalism, as opposed to multiculturalism, emphasizes programs that bring minorities together into, direct engagement with the majority culture and mainstream organized institutions. Importantly, however, and I think this is a very important point, that interculturalism, so that it doesn't become lip service, it should encourage members of the majority culture to question their own assumptions and open channels of communication and interaction with minorities. And this is very important. This idea of assumptions about the other can be a serious barrier, and especially if these assumptions are based on a deficit approach, as opposed to what Professor Tahira said, this strength-based approach. Sometimes we look at the other in a deficit approach, and so fundamentally, majority culture must begin to question their own assumptions of the other. And this is where perhaps the negative or pejorative assumptions about the other, whether this other is a religious group or a religious community or a cultural community, is dominated because of the discourse that is out there. So, we cannot ignore, for example, the fact that Islam and Muslims, and certainly other Eastern cultures, so for example, African communities, have been portrayed negatively in countries like Australia and in the West broadly before 9/11, but this was amplified since 9/11 and subsequent events. We can't ignore that. And therefore, if the majority of Australian culture or the majority of Australians are to question their own assumptions and open channels of communication and interaction with the other, in this case, let's say Australian Muslims, then a focus on Islamic studies or religious studies in this particular case would be important. But it's not a theological understanding of the tradition in our case, in the case of the Islamic studies that we have, the emphasis is on interconnectedness of civilizations. So ignoring the reliance and indeed interconnectedness of peoples, nations, and civilizations can lead definitely to stereotyping and othering that diminishes people into an abyss of nothingness, allowing for their dehumanization and discrimination. So if you look at, in the case of East-West relations, most people in the West naturally assume that the East and the West are and always have been separate and different entities. And it is the autonomous or pristine West that has alone pioneered the creation of the modern world. And that is problematic. We cannot move into a truly intercultural society unless we begin to debunk these narratives. In the case of Islamic studies, it can help us debunk this traditional view and show that it is not only deceptively seductive, this idea that the West is the West because of itself and not because of reliance and interconnectedness on the Chinese civilization, the African civilization, the Islamic civilization, the Persian civilization, the Greek civilization. That idea that the West is what it is because only of itself is deceptively seductive. But also it ignores the fact that the West and the East have been fundamentally and consistently interlinked through scientific, technological, cultural aspects for centuries, in fact. And what is unfortunate is that you find most people are unaware of these things. And so the focus always is on certain negative aspects of culture or civilization or tradition without a wider and a deeper and a richer appreciation of the other. So in the case, say, of Islam-West relations, one can easily argue that Islam has had a tremendous impact on the making of the West or Europe. But also one could extend that argument and say, in fact, the East itself had a tremendous impact on the making of Europe. And, you know, I encourage our listeners, for example, to consult the book by John Dobson on the Eastern origin of the Western civilization. So this understanding, the understanding that these people whom we have defined as the other have actually contributed substantially to the making of who we are today. And this can greatly help teach us about interculturalism in substantial ways that not only dispel stereotypes, but more importantly, can create a positive image of the other. And so allow me to give you some examples, historical examples. I know history can be boring to some people, you know, and students find it boring, but if we present it in a way, and if we present these studies in a way that demonstrate this interconnectedness, and that no civilization and no culture just emerges out of nothingness or emerges in a vacuum, then we can perhaps begin to change this narrative about the other. So, you know, one could ask that, or one could easily argue that if you look at the Islamic civilization and their contribution to science and mathematics and astronomy and medicine would be actually insignificant without the giants like Ptolemy, Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen. There was this interconnectedness between them. Where would Da Vinci or Ficino or Copernicus be without the likes of the Ibn Shatir, the Syrian astronomer, or Al-Khwarizmi, or the Persian At-Tusi, or the Andalusian Ibn Rushd? We now know that Copernicus, for example, could not have arrived at his heliocentric view of the world or the universe without the work of the Persian astronomers and the Syrian astronomers. And indeed, Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer and supposedly the first European to reach India by sea, fades into the marginalized shadows, which is cast by the brilliance of Asia's vast civilization. These are important narratives and historical richness that we need to bring to the discussion, right from primary school into high school, into university, in order to create that positive image of the other, not based on a passive tolerance, but based on a deep, rich understanding, So, for example, in his book, God's Crucible, Islam and the Making of Europe, David Lewis argues that Andalusians in the 12th, 13th, and the 14th centuries, both Muslims and non-Muslims, were working together under the positive multicultural atmosphere which existed at the time of the La Convivencia, which assimilated the knowledge coming to them from, at the time, the Muslim world, which benefited from the Indian civilization and the Greek civilization and the Chinese civilization, brought all that together in Spain in the 12th, 13th century in the sciences and humanities with an almost untroubled eagerness, thereby creating a basis of knowledge that would provide the foundation for the Renaissance in Christendom that was certain to come. In Toledo, for example, the translation from Arabic into Latin was undertaken by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And at the time, Toledo experienced its remarkable, prodigious interfaith collaboration. This work of interconnectedness is significant to interculturalism, an appreciation of the interconnectedness of cultures and civilizations. And I would call it, what I have been advocating for and speaking about, this interconnectedness of civilizations, delivered a volume of translated data that significantly lifted the cultural level of the West, and that cannot be ignored. By the 13th century, magnificent scholars like Ibn Rushd or Averroes was recognized in the Western world as the commentator of Aristotle, contributing thereby to the rediscovered master Aristotle after centuries of near total oblivion in Western Europe. And recently in his book, God's Shadow, God's Shadow, Sultan Salim, the Ottoman Empire and the Making of the Modern World, Professor Alan Mikhail of Yale University compellingly argues that the Ottomans and Islam shaped the European, Native American, and African cultures and histories. And therefore, to fully and accurately understand the history of the West, the history of Australia, the history of America, we must grasp these other histories too. We cannot speak about interculturalism, for example, without understanding the history of the indigenous people of this nation, of the Aboriginal people, and the magnificent civilization and contributions they have made. And not just by mere lip service, but a deeper, richer understanding. Professor Mikhail also argues that since the 19th century, for example, the idea of the West has indeed come to rely on the absence of the Eastern civilization, the absence of Islam, the absence of India, the absence of Persia, meaning Europe just emerged from in a vacuum. And then Europe and America overcame this most significant of historical enemies, the story goes supposedly, to lead the world forward. This is all historical absurdity, and we have to confront this head on. In another book, which I alluded to earlier, The Eastern Origins of Western Civilization, John Hobson argues that it is true that Europe eventually succeeded in taking these Eastern ideas further, but without the original Eastern ideas in the first place, there would have been little or nothing to take further. So not only was ancient Greek civilization significantly derived from ancient Egypt, classical Islamic civilization was also significantly influenced by ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian civilization. By extension, the East, including the Islamic, the Chinese, the African, the Persian civilizations, provided a cultural role in enabling the rise of modern Western civilization. This is a narrative of history that defies the assumptions of the majority culture about the East and the West. And that has to be tackled in ways that can enrich us all and not begin to pitch us against one and the other. And as Professor Tahira mentioned, this idea of the us and them is so destructive. And fundamentally, when there is a lack of awareness or ignorance of the so-called other, then we fall in this pitfall and in in this deficit thinking of the other. Allow me to finish with a wonderful quote again by Professor Mikhail, who argues that and that's in his own words, cutting Muslims out of the major historical events of the last 5 centuries. And I would argue, I would add, cutting the Eastern world or the Eastern civilizations out of the major historical events of the last 5 centuries, cuts them out of our understanding of how we arrived at our modern world. And instead of seeing Islam or the East or the Africans or the Chinese or the Persians as integral and a constructive force that it was, we have decided to see them as outsiders, as the other, as the enemy. And if we erroneously continue with this understanding and keep them outside of the history of Australia or the history of the West or the history of Europe, it becomes easier to keep them outside of our present and more difficult for us today to integrate them in our own societies in ways that are wholesome and in ways that are positive. And therefore, we need to argue that interculturalism must, by necessity, force, in this particular case, the majority society and undoubtedly the minority communities to question their own assumptions of the other and begin to build a rich heritage and understanding of the immense contributions that all civilizations have contributed to one another to become who we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and I'm very keen to discuss this topic a bit more during the question time. Our final speaker is Associate Professor Shanton Chang. Mr. Chang's topic is particularly important in today's time because without doubt, many aspects of our social and work life is moving online. Using the power of social media, we've seen incredible change for people of colour and minorities. Most recently, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement, and that has brought about wide sweeping change across industries. However, the digital world is also a platform where hate groups and extremists can spread their campaigns and gather support. Mr. Chang's research has also found online platforms are written with inbuilt cultural bias, aesthetic and even content organization. I'll hand it over to him to explain further.
Thank you very much, Zoeba. And one of the challenges in doing this presentation was I knew I was going to follow up on 2 amazing speakers, our esteemed professors. So how do you follow up? So I knew it was going to be difficult. And so I do have some slides to share. And the way that I'm presenting this is in 3 ways to answer the question of that the future is intercultural, as our esteemed professors have talked about, but the future is also digital. So then how do you build the intercultural and the digital together when there are lots of layers of complexity that we have to unpack? And one of the things that occurred to me was we actually have to go back to our very assumptions, and both professors have already talked about actually challenging our own assumptions. One of the key assumptions that we make is that we are multicultural. What exactly does that mean here in Australia? And so I have a slide talking about, that there are different ways that people look at multiculturalism. And so what better way to show multiculturalism than to present it as fruit platters, right? And there are different ways to present fruit platters. And if you look at the slides that I have 4 different pictures of fruit platters. You've got a fruit platter with, it's almost like a fruit salad where all the bits of fruits are cut together very nicely and all mixed up. Then you've got another fruit salad that's less of a fruit salad, but more of a compote. All the berries have been melted in together with the oranges and everything just looks red, for example. Then you could have a nice platter of fruits where you have a nice, pattern where the oranges are in one row and then it's swirling around the kiwi fruits, it's swirling around the apples, and they're all staying within their boundaries. Really lovely, well presented. Or you can have, somebody like me, perhaps bringing a fruit platter where, you just put the fruits where you think they should be, and they're all mixed up. Okay, it's of a mess. And the reality is that this is actually the point that depending on where you're coming from, of what is your model of multiculturalism, is really going to impact on what you think intercultural communication is going to be. This is actually work that reflects on Barry's model of intercultural studies, looking at the model of multiculturalism, of, the extent to which cultural groups are more likely to preserve their own culture versus they are more willing to be open and to learn from other cultures, compared against their desire to be more interactive with other cultures or to actually keep to themselves. Depending on that, you start to see that there are many different models of multiculturalism. And often I ask the question, the challenge for anyone coming into any of those models of multiculturalism is, imagine now the fruit platters that you have, and now you want to introduce a new fruit. And because of the region that I originally come from, which is Southeast Asia, I'm going to introduce durian to the fruit platters. Where are you going to put the durians in the fruit platter, right? In each of those 4 pictures of fruit platters, the durian is going to stand out like a sore durian, if you like, right? But in some of the models, they're going to stand out even more than in other models where they can just fit in particular corners or particular section, where it doesn't matter where you are expected to be part of the salad, right? So this is the point. This means that every interaction between the different types of fruits, the different types of culture, brings with it different flavors in terms of how we accept, how we open our hearts, how we resist, and also how we move forward in the way that we interact with new cultures, or in this case, new fruits, as part of our salad. And so I think that one of the challenges that we have in the conversation around interculturalism is people come with their own views of what multiculturalism is. If you come with a view that multiculturalism is occasionally going to Yam Cha on a weekend and occasionally going to a farmer's market where you might be introduced to new Persian cuisine, then it's not the integrated model that we've been talking about in these presentations, right? We're really talking about a more marginalized or segmented or ghettoized multiculturalism. And that is not a good place to start. Unfortunately, when you look at a lot of the conversations at the national level around multiculturalism, and everybody talks about Australia being multicultural, there are really difficult issues around how they understand multiculturalism and the dominance of particular culture in this model of multiculturalism. If we want a truly integrated approach, we really have to rethink how we interact. And this is why the whole intercultural piece forces the cultures to actually start talking to each other rather than minding their own business. One of the key things is that a lot of us have come from traditions where we are told that good people mind their own business. Now, interculturalism, therefore, is quite radical in a sense, because it's saying, no, stop minding your own business and go and say hi to your neighbors who look a bit different to you. Not something that my parents would have taught me, which was mind your own business and don't rock the boat, right? So this issue then becomes a challenging aspect of how we interact with other cultures in the face-to-face manner. But as we move into this 21st century, where the digital environment has now become so much a part of our lives, you just have to think about how much time as human beings we spend in the digital world. I have a picture here showing you that we spend so much time online. It's not just kids and teenagers, it's also adults. Most of us would spend no less than 4 to 5 hours online interacting, communicating, whether it's for work and also socially for entertainment and where we get our news as well. But we don't all do it in the same way. I've got another picture here showing you, for example, that people from Chinese background use completely different social media platforms, use different outlets of news and different types of apps where they get their information and their social connectedness. So what it means is that the digital space is not the same for everyone. Depending on where you come from, websites of different cultures and different languages are laid out completely differently. And here I show you examples that You know, you could have Japanese websites that looks really busy. You could have Middle Eastern websites that and also reminiscent of South Asian websites that has a lot of pictures and a few words, very colorful pictures. You could go to South Korea where you have very cute, you know, jumping stars, very cute cartoons as part of normal corporate websites, through to very highly contextual websites. So one of the key things here is that when you look at all these websites, one of the key things that's really important to recognize is that people get their information and interact differently with each other online. Now, what happens when they all come to multicultural Australia? If you look at our government websites, and, you know, coming from Melbourne, we are currently having a debate around how we communicate on public health when we outreach to culturally, linguistically, multicultural and multi-faith communities, whether our governments and our organizations have successfully communicated across cultures. And one of the key things is when you come to Australia, it is assumed that you communicate the way that the Australians communicate digitally. And what I've just shown you is that different cultures come with different mindsets and mind maps of how they find information digitally. So what it means then is where are all these intercultural connections happening, right? Another example that I will give you is that when you look at, for example, if you have a Chinese community that's communicating mostly WeChat, Weibo, whereas the Australian community is communicating on Instagram and on Facebook. They're like parallel universe, and then there's no intercultural happening there, is there, right? They're not even communicating. So what happens then is you have the thought bubbles starting to happen. And bubbles, internet bubbles, where you exclude people that you do not like, cultures that you do not like, and you try to create your own space and curate your content so that you're only seeing what you like, is the antithesis of intercultural movement that we are talking about. Because interculturalism is talking across cultures, whereas so much of the digital space is about curating your content so that you unfriend all the people that you do not like, right? For our own sanity, and I completely understand that, you don't want to be reading what trolls have to say about you all the time, but at the same time, it can pose a challenge and a barrier to interculturalism. What it also means for new migrants coming to Australia is that if you don't feel that you are connected to the wider Australian digital society, you will continue to engage more closely with your own community. And that can be in a completely different language, in a completely different social media platform. And mostly, and rightly so, you will be more strongly connected to your people from back home where you've come from. And so then integration becomes a challenge because there is no intercultural connectedness in the digital world. So what it means here is that for new migrants, we have to actually quite difficult as it is, we have to really understand how it is that, what are the Australian norms, what are the ways that Australians use information. But for Australia, welcoming new cultures, we really have to reach out and say, it's not just our way. We have to show you how we do it. And this is how we understand how you do it. Let's talk about it. And I think that at the moment, the public health sector, public service sector, they're not really doing it because they have a one-size-fits-all. And the one-size-fits-all usually just means it fits the majority. It fits the way that we are used to doing things. And that's how we keep going. Becomes a problem, right? So then going back and away from the digital space, how do we approach this issue? Well, you know, we are talking about religion. I reflected on my own background and my own faith, and from my childhood, you know, remembering the teachings in the Bible. One of the things that we learn is the golden rule, and the golden rule states you treat others how you want to be treated. That's very important. But if you think about it for a moment, the golden rule that states you treat others how you want to be treated can be quite problematic in a multicultural, intercultural space. Because actually in the intercultural space, we like to jokingly say that the platinum rule is more important. Do you know what the platinum rule is? It is treat others how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated. Because we all like different things. Coming from different cultures, we might have slightly different values, different cuisines, for example. Intercultural sense, the titanium rule of treating people how they want to be treated is just as crucial as the golden rule, because we're not all necessarily the same. However, reflecting on that, coming from a university, we also believe in education. And the reality is, with our students, we don't just give our students everything that they want. So if we apply the platinum rule to university, which says give the students whatever they want, we might as well just give them a degree and not challenge them to do anything, right? So we can't do that either, right? So when we are working across cultures at universities, we then adopt the third rule, which is what I call the titanium rule, which is the core realities of human connections that are non-negotiable. Here are the standards that maintain. Everything else is negotiable and an adventure for interculturalism. So you have to know where your baseline is. You know, the things that our professors have been talking about today around human connections, those will not change, but how you communicate and how you share, those should be adapted for the different cultures. And I think that's where we are with the intercultural space. And if you look at how we apply that to the digital space, it's doing the same thing of saying the messages have to be the same, but because people from particular cultures tend to like their information presented in a slightly different way, we have to acknowledge that. And if we realize that they're using different social media platforms, we have to acknowledge that. But the fundamental messaging remains the same. And we have to do this mapping. So there's quite a bit of work to be done for us to be truly intercultural in a digital world as well. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Associate Professor Shenton Chang. I love the imagery you used of the fruit salads. It makes me wonder if the future is intercultural, what kind of fruit salad are we going to look like? So now let's get to question time, and I might start with some specific questions directed to your topics, and then we'll move on to some more general questions about interculturalism. So let's go back to Tahira, who was our first speaker. Tahira, do you believe our societies and government, why do you believe our societies and government have taken such a long time to see interculturalism as a two-way street? And why have we historically been more, I guess, stuck onto this approach of assimilation rather than integration?
Thank you, Soeba, for this insightful question. I personally feel out of the necessity at the time, probably was not given enough attention that integration is the best approach, because it is part of part of humans' nature. What they think, that what they believe, they think the others who are in a minority, they have to follow them, and without any ill intention. That was something that, although multiculturalism was introduced, but it's still the way I think the way things were panned out was still with the favoring of that othering, that majority and minority, and the minority needed to follow the majority, which again, with the overarching values, definitely that should be the way to go. But the less we know about the other cultures, the more we fear about how this, if they come into that sort of equation, how they may take over. And I think the concept of integration was not, again, from my perspective, was not well received, because it was not well understood the benefit that those minorities could bring to the majority's table within the culture. The richness, as Professor Muhammad has so much emphasized on, that blend of the two, how much could benefit everyone. And I think that is one of the issues that holding back, or the delay, if I may call it, in that. But now that there are many many research with evidence-based practice, they indicated, and not just very recently, in the last couple of decades, mostly, that integration is not only benefiting the individual's well-being who integrate, it benefits the majority, the society as well. I think that has been taken much more seriously, and the dialogue has come into that picture. And I, again, on a personal note, for me, when I see this is coming as a sort of a push, as I mentioned, I have been in Australia 34 years. When it came as a push and find it as a challenge, for me, I thought this challenge is a good opportunity for me to how I could make the best of it. For them to not to see me as someone who is very different. Of course, it's different, but at the same time, I have lots of shared values. Those shared values, I dwelled into the strength of what we commonly hold. And those, again, those common human values, if I may call it. And I turned challenges into opportunities. And through that trust relationship that I managed to develop, I could personally hold my, again, primary values and secondary values, that those secondary values still overlap with primary values, but on a different level, and it is in practice in different levels and in different environments. I managed to integrate while even assimilation was preferred. For them, that was through my own demonstration of I am a value to this society through my own way of looking at things without taking shelter into myself and use the separation approach. I don't want to get mixed with you. I got mixed with them. I offered what I could offer from the depth of my abilities, and that enhanced my relationship within that equation and enabled me to still integrate, get to know other cultures as well. And then through that exchange, I could also convey my message. I am a better servant, if I call it that way. I'm a better servant to humanity, and in this case, to my own people in Australia. When I say my own people, again, taking that us approach, whole Australian approach. And I said, now I can serve better then because I hold my values, because when I feel I need to take shelter as home, Australia is my home, but within that home, I have a home as well. And that home is the primary level that I grew up with, and those core values that I hold on to. And through that exchange, I think that was also something that in my dialogue within any organization that I have worked with, they understood me perfectly because I opened that dialogue without taking offense. I had that sort of attitude to gratitude because, again, with the strengths approach, I tried to see many benefits of me living in Australia, and I brought those benefits into the dialogue, and they could see me as someone who is acknowledging and it is adding. And I think that is a level of exchange that we are craving for, and it started almost 2 decades ago. But it continues, and in the last 3 decades or over 3 decades I have been here, I have seen a major shift in the way of attitudes of majority on minorities, and I think that is due again to that level of exchange that people brought into that equation of the dialogue and bringing this again strengths-based approach.
Professor Muhammad Abdullah, I might go to you. Did you feel like you had to assimilate in any way into Australian culture, and did that provide challenges with being a Muslim and being visibly Muslim?
I felt those pressures definitely, not necessarily from colleagues or friends, friends at your school or university or colleagues, but more so from media and political discourse, relentless over the last 20 years in a way to seek to compel us to assimilate. And I have seen the impact of that on the lives of young Australian Muslims who, though born in this country, felt they don't belong to this country. There is a sense that they don't belong. Personally, despite visibly looking Muslim, I would say I have some groundings. I am strong in my principles and beliefs and values, and I have a deep appreciation of both my faith, but also the Australian community and the Australian context. And both that allowed me to, if you like, synthesize identities which were discussed before, being an Australian Muslim, and I don't see contradictions in that. But that does not mean that that is not the way other young people feel. Other young people who maybe grew up in this country and born in this country, and all they have witnessed over the last 20 years is a barrage of attack on their own culture and identity from media or from certain politicians. We cannot ignore the fact that they have been drastically challenged in their own identities, and they have been felt to a sense of compulsion to assimilate rather than integrate.
Associate Professor Shanton Chang, I want to ask you something specifically about the digital world. So we hear a lot about algorithms and how they play a role in our social media platforms, like you explained, how they pick and choose what we see on our news feeds. Do you think these algorithms, particularly for people that are constantly looking at racist or negative material, does that hamper interculturalism?
I think that's a great question and a very interesting one, because the way that many algorithms work that leads to what you actually see online when you type in keywords and all that is that it also builds on your history of what you are watching, what you are looking, what you are avoiding, what you are accessing online. So it's collecting data of you. If you, for example, as a person keeps looking for particular types of information, and you continue to look at it, then it will present you with more of that information, thinking that that's what you want. So algorithms tend to predict what you want to see or what you want to avoid. And so it tries to accentuate what you want. So if you, for example, then keep deleting those kind of information, you will start to get into a situation where you start to have your bubble, where you are protected from all this in a sense. But this is also why a lot of young people are turning away from media, from mainstream media, because of all the things that we've been talking about, the negativism, and it's not conducive for engagement when you sweepingly talk about an entire culture and make them responsible for the actions of a few people. I mean, if we did that with every culture, this will never end, right? That's the reality. And so what it is when you have that barrage and people keep seeing it, and if sooner or later, the algorithm will work out that you don't want to see it, and so you start to only see what you want. And actually, that is very good for the protection of the people who are consuming the social media and the news. But on the other hand, it also means that we are creating barriers between different groups of people, and that there's not going to be the intercultural communication and connections that we want. In fact, what we want is for people to explore each other's culture and to have those dialogue and conversations. And I fear that that's not happening on so many different levels. And the algorithms contribute to that as well.
So I guess if it is going to be intercultural, then the digital companies would have to make an effort to reduce some of those bubbles or open up some of those bubbles.
But also the bubbles are also the designed by the people who use it themselves. They create the bubbles as well for their own protection. We don't want to ask the internet companies to open up those bubbles if there are no protections for the people who are most vulnerable. I think that's a key thing as well. We don't want to subject a particular group based on whatever demographic it is to a lot of negativity to the point where they cannot. The only way to do it is to stay away from social media. So it is quite a complex issue around how do we deal with these bubbles. But I think as policymakers, as researchers, as service providers, we need to be aware of these bubbles and take responsibility for making the digital environment a safe space. Currently, it is not a safe space for intercultural interactions because it is very us against them, whoever the us is and whoever the them is.
Thank you. A burning question that I have for you guys is, how do we engage with people in groups that are actually reluctant to embrace diversity? I might start off with Tahira, if you want to start.
I think the golden key for me to break down those barriers always has been through projection and injection of love rather than hatred, rather than that separation. The more I have seen, just put myself in their shoes, why they are doing that, why they are disengaging, why they are not seeing me as the added value to the society. And just questioning again the way of my internal dialogue between my mind and my heart, and try to harmonize the two and find some rationale. That has been the key element for me to shift that. Instead of taking again that hatred approach, taking a love approach, to try again through that strength approach to bring the reason behind why they are doing that and why they are not doing that. And I think, again, from my perspective, love is something that it embraces and it melts other people's, it embraces diversity, but at the same time, it brings a sort of a touch of the human inside those human, that they could bring the best part of them into that interaction. And I have been, I should say, very fortunate being able to take that approach, and that has benefited me a lot in the way of my interaction with others and in the way of my contribution into, again, society at large, because I could demonstrate to them, to those who are even reluctant to receive whatever I want to give, I have been able to demonstrate I'm not a consumer only, I am a contributor. And through that exchange of I'm not a consumer, I'm the contributor into this society, they open up and they offer further opportunities or greater opportunities for that contribution. And I think that could be a good way for that exchange, the key of replacing hatred with or hatred approach to a love approach to these sort of situations.
What about you, Shantan? Have you had to face people that were reluctant to embrace diversity? How did you deal with that?
There are three things that I would talk about. The first one is threat. People are often threatened when they don't have enough information and they don't know about particular cultures. Or they might have certain stereotypes that make them feel threatened. And I think it's also really looking at what it is that threatens them and respecting that they feel the threat. The second one is to actually deal with anxiety. People who are threatened are very anxious that, you are here to take their job, you are here to take whatever, you are here to change the world, whatever. So the addressing the threat and managing the anxiety levels of, and what Professor Tahira was saying about, showing them that there are some commonalities and human values is actually quite important. Before showing the difference, let's start, but at the same time, at some point, we have to show them the difference as well, because we don't want to minimize our own cultures and say that we are all the same, which is not the case all the time, right? And so once you've dealt with the threat and once you've dealt with the anxiety, then you can start to celebrate. But you can't jump into celebration without actually addressing. We are such a divided world at the moment. It's so us against them, especially in the digital space, that, there is no way of having productive conversations unless you address what it is that people are fearing at the moment. And I think that's really important for both sides.
Mm-hmm. Professor Muhammad Abdullah, you talked a little bit about how religion can bring people together. And there's obviously going to be a lot of people that use recent and past examples where that hasn't actually been the case. How do you think religious communities can encourage interculturalism through faith rather than othering other groups?
Yeah, well, first they need to themselves begin to appreciate the richness of cultures and their diversities. And I have always said to particularly religious leaders in the last 20, 25 years, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Jewish or whatever, in fact, religious leaders, just like political leaders, have a moral imperative, an added responsibility to use their pulpits and platforms to spread this idea of interculturalism, to move away from hate, preaching of hate and preaching of othering, and to use the core values of their faith traditions. And if you look across all the faiths in the world, there are core universal values that we all share, as have been articulated already by the other colleagues. And if I may, I know perhaps just on the previous point, I think it's difficult but not impossible, this idea of reaching out to those who don't want to listen. I have been doing it for since the burning of our mosques 2 weeks after 9/11. And I've gone across Australia, and it's not easy. We cannot assume it's an easy task, especially for younger people. But what we must realize that if we are to reach out to those who are not interested, there has to be a collective responsibility approach. The responsibility must not be on the shoulders only of those minority communities who are under the hammer, or those people who are, subjected to stereotyping. It is a collective approach. There has to be a change of narrative right at the top level, from our leaders, to our media, to our religious leaders, to our academics. We have witnessed firsthand when a leader of a nation comes out and says something negative about a particular group, it allows and it feeds into that legitimacy to begin to hate. And so this is a collective approach that requires patience, perseverance, being proactive, and not to reciprocate bad with bad and evil with evil.
Final question, because we are running out of time, but it's something I really want to ask you guys. And it's a bit of a practical question, because I think young people like myself could learn a lot from you guys and, the experience that you've had throughout your lives. So I really want to ask you, how would you handle a situation when you don't have the upper hand? Maybe you've just got a job, or your boss makes a remark that you don't agree with, that is either offensive to your cultural, religious beliefs or someone else's. What do you do in that situation? What's the best way to handle it? I might start off with Shenton, if you want to answer.
I'll start with the difficult questions. No time to think on my feet. I think that if I've learned anything from so many years of working and teaching in this environment and working with young people, is that we have slightly different approaches to how we confront challenges. In my day, when I was a young person, I learned which battles to fight to win the war. So I'm using terrible metaphors here, but really I'm thinking about, there are times when it is not worth the cognitive effort and emotional load, right? I don't have to fight every time, but at the same time, I need to make sure that my points get pushed across when I am comfortable and when I'm confident and when I have had a space where I can build my case. And, thinking on your feet and responding immediately is not always the best response in a volatile environment where you are feeling hurt. And this is another thing. I keep going back to the digital, and this is why people on digital, they can do it immediately. They don't stop and think. And so for me, the biggest advice I can give is, stopping and thinking for a moment and re-strategizing is a strength, not a weakness in this situation.
Thank you. What about you, Tahira? Do you think that you should take on every battle?
Again, I usually try to take a much more bigger picture approach. And again, attitude to gratitude. I try to tap into the benefits of me within that environment that has provided me the opportunity to whatever I'm doing, whether it is an organizational level, community level, societal level. And I try to, again, that cultural fitness that I mentioned, to use it as a great opportunity, as if that may be challenging, I turn it into opportunity and reflect and see why this is happening, and rather than take a silence approach, because silence is not a passive reaction. I think it is a very powerful reaction, because that gives me the space for me to reflect on what is happening here, or what I am doing on a self-reflection, what also I am doing that this challenge has taken place. And again, with that cultural fitness, I try to respect the norm of that organization, the culture of that organization, and I see where are the common space and where are not overlapping, and what is the issue. And I try again with that level of approach of again, a positive attitude to gratitude approach. I try to shift it from a deficit to a strength, and I can't even find an equal that it hasn't given me the best outcome, because again of my positive approach. And me as a positive psychologist, I think that has been a key, absolutely a major key to for me to keep my self-esteem high, and also to be resilient enough to go through all of the challenges of in all levels of life, including, the working life. Just to, through that strengths approach, I try to bring, again, my best to the fore, how I could, again, continue that advocacy. I don't lose the bigger picture, and I don't want to dwell into a very small, narrow way of approach, because I lose the insight. And I have been lucky enough that, as I mentioned, all the time, and I think it is working because of the strengths approach, because of the positive approach that I have had, and attitude to gratitude that I have had. And that shifts even the environment, the culture of that environment, and brings much more positiveness. And then that may not happen to someone who is similar to me with with other differences, because I have been in the forefront. I faced it differently, and then I paved the way for others not to have that much of the challenge.
Mohammed Abdallah, let's wrap it up with you. If you're a young person, or even an older person that is in a situation where someone close to you, someone you know, someone that has the upper hand, has said something about yourself or someone else that's been discriminatory, or that didn't, fit with this idea of interculturalism, how do you handle that? Tahira talked a bit about how gratitude and being positive, but it's really hard to be positive in those situations. What would you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for that. And I agree with what was said as far as principles that can give us resilience and give us strength. Absolutely. And there are times where we may have to forgive and forget, but there are instances where we'll have to stand up, but be polite, but firm, but polite. And young people must not feel that they should not speak out. They should feel that they have the absolute right to speak out and stand up against, what they perceive to be unjust, or to be stereotyping them, or being racial towards them. And conversation, we can never underestimate the value and the power of conversation. I'll give you a typical example that happened with me recently. And this is one of many, many examples that I have experienced. So immediately after Christchurch, the horrible massacre of 51 people, as you know, immediately after that, by 1 or 2 weeks, a staff at a university, posts some really horrible things about the Muslim community. And instead of learning from the tragedy, they tried to post things that are. So this came to my attention, and there was going to be some serious action taken about this particular staff. When I was informed about it, I said, could I please have the opportunity to sit and speak with this person, to have a conversation? Because just like Shanton mentioned, ignorance can create so much fear and anxiety. And people, you know, inwardly, most people are good. They just need that opportunity to have a conversation. Anyhow, to cut a long story short, they said, are you sure you want to sit with this person? You know, the things he said. I said, definitely, I want to sit with this, please give me the opportunity. So I went and they had him in this office, and, you know, it was like guarded because they were concerned what's going to happen. I walked in, and the way he was sitting was very negative, was very not receptive. As soon as I walked in, because I'm a tall person, he said, oh, do you play basketball? This is how the conversation started. I said, yeah, actually, I did play basketball when I was in high school. And, you know, I broke my both wrists one day playing basketball. So that's for the next 10 minutes, we're talking about basketball. Then we just sat and had a decent conversation. And what I have found out is that he knows absolutely nothing about the Muslim community. In fact, he was under the perception that 50% of Australia are Muslims, right? And they are going to take over. And that all Muslim women cover their face, for example. And I simply, with a very polite approach, debunked these myths. And we walked out of that room together to the car park as if nothing happened. Never, ever underestimate the power of conversation, of polite conversation, and of trying to dispel these, not through anger and not through revenge, but through cordial conversations, if possible.
Thank you. I wish I was a fly on the wall during that conversation. Also, didn't know you played basketball. I always wondered how you were so tall. I have many more questions to ask you guys, but unfortunately we don't have enough time. So that brings an end to our session, and hopefully our viewers took away something useful from it. Thank you to our three speakers, Associate Professor Tahira Zizian, Shanton Chang, and Professor Muhammad Abdullah. And a special thanks to the Hawke Centre at the University of South Australia and the Australian Refugee Association for having me. I'll hand it over to Deb from ARA, who will wrap up the session.
Thank you, Suwaiba. Well, it's actually very hard to wrap up such an amazing session. I am enormously grateful to all of our amazing, charismatic, erudite and insightful speakers. Really, I can't thank you enough. But I will thank you, and I've got a couple of points to wrap up with. But I also wanted to thank Jacinta Thompson and the Hawke Centre staff, because this has been a great partnership with the Australian Refugee Association. We've been doing the orations for about a decade now, and it's my passion as the CEO of ARA to make sure that we bring diverse voices to a public stage, and that we are actually engaging across the breadth of our multicultural country, so that we can actually all learn from each other. That's really my single most abiding passion with the oration. But I want to thank Professor Muhammad Abdullah. I have heard him before. He is a brilliant and I love history, so I love listening to Muhammad. I absolutely adore the history of the Middle East, so I would listen to you all day, Muhammad. I also want to thank, and so Professor Abdullah for the Centre for Islamic Thought and Education at the University of SA, thank you so much. And Associate Professor Tahira Zizian from the University of SA, I'll get the Department of Right, Justice and Society. You are the most compassionate lecturer I probably have ever come across in my life, and that's no reflection on Shanton and Muhammad, but your compassion just shines through, so thank you so much. And to Shanton, who's a wonderful old friend of mine, and also a very he's kind of, to me, a bit of the international go-to expert on many of the things that Shanton's talked about today. And it's wonderful for me to actually sit and listen to him in a professional context. I mean, it's also nice to sit across a dinner table and listen to Shanton, but it's also, it's really rewarding for me to see the thought, the contribution that Shanton and Tahira and Muhammad are making to the academic life of Australia. And I have hope for young people, and I know I can't understand the experience of young people, particularly young women, who display their faith, who are often in the forefront of racist attacks. And I know it must be hard sometimes to believe in an accepting culture and an accepting Australia, or that the future is intercultural, but I believe that it is the way we'll all be because of young people and because of the people in academia, such as our wonderful lecturers today, because good education is an antidote to the bubbles that Shanton and others have talked about. Good education and powerful academics who work directly with young people are a way to help shape, not just shape minds, but open up minds and shape some of the discussion. And I do have a lot of faith in that future, but I can't imagine how hard it feels sometimes for young people who, walk into a shop and the colour of their skin determines how they're treated, or a woman walking down the street. And I do, we all have seen how COVID, the era of COVID has tested us communities. Not only is there a need for interculturalism around multicultural and diverse communities, but we have debates where we talk about letting old people die peacefully, and we have debates about whose fault somebody else getting sick is, and we have debates about people who feel like they shouldn't be stuck at home. And so I think that's shown us that we've got a capacity for great tolerance and also for a capacity for great intolerance when we're under pressure. And I think as a society, it's about us making sure that when we have future pressures, that interculturalism is a source of strength and it's our backbone rather than a nice to have concept. And I do think it requires white Anglo-Saxon middle-aged people such as myself to lean in. We shouldn't just be consuming this, we should be active participants in being the change that we want, so that younger people can have basically a different world than what they've inherited. So if I didn't finish my thank yous, I will finish them off. So I didn't quite finish thanking our wonderful ABC journalist, Suwaiba Hanifi, and also the staff of ARA and the volunteers of ARA who've helped make today possible as well. And for our listeners, I hope you really have got a lot out of the Oration, and please visit the Hawke Centre website where you'll find a link to the Oration. Send it as widely as you can. We want lots of people to listen. You've all been amazing. Thank you so much.